The dead in Christ shall rise, Paul teaches. He doesn't say that the wicked in Christ are the wicked. That's an oxymoron. There's no such wicked in Christ. Or the wicked, those who are not in Christ. He doesn't say those who are not in Christ will rise. So we who read our New Testament, apostolic scriptures, we're holding to this idea that resurrection is for the righteous, meaning those who died in Messiah. This would include Paul at the moment, right? At the time of this recording, Paul is one of the righteous dead in Messiah. So when Paul talked about the dead in Christ will rise first, and we who are alive and remain will be caught up. It's interesting that he said at the time that he's writing, he said we who are alive. That doesn't apply to him anymore because he's not alive, but it can apply to us, this generation. You know, if your Lord chooses to come back today, then I think I could count myself. In fact, I know I would count myself among those of the we who are alive. But point is, in Isaiah here where he says, your dead will live, their corpses will rise, you who lie in the dust awake and shout for joy. For your dew is as the dew of the dawn, and the earth will give birth to departed spirits. This is a resurrection event, but it can't be for those in national Israel who've not placed their faith in Messiah. So Isaiah must have only been referring to righteous ones who will live, meaning when we apply that using New Testament logic or New Testament revelation, we know this must be believers in Jesus. But other than that, it wouldn't make much sense. And indeed, the reason I'm pointing out is because verse 19 with the resurrection happens prior to verse 20, which talks about come my people and hide. And the point I'm bringing up is sequentially, why would Israel hide at the midpoint of the week and then go through a rapture, right? Go back over to my slide here. And the midpoint of the week is the abomination of desolation. Like you see the arrow pointing over here, that one right there. That's the midpoint of the week. Well, if that's when Israel went into hiding at the midpoint, well, that would correspond with Isaiah chapter 20. The resurrection event that we just read about is Isaiah chapter 19. But the resurrection event isn't until after the midpoint. See what I'm saying? The sequence would be out of order if we were taking Isaiah to be referring to Israel. Now, are they going to experience a resurrection near the end of the week? At the end of the 70th week, when Jesus returns and rescues them and brings them into personal salvation. I'm not yet prepared to say that they are going to experience a physical resurrection, because that seems to be reserved for those who are in Messiah. In other words, those who are part of the church that we call church proper. But a spiritual resurrection from the dead, absolutely. Like Paul talks about in Romans chapter 11, what will their acceptance of Jesus be but life from the dead? And the reference I'm referring to there is, I do want to pull this one up, is actually in Romans 11, probably around verse 26, 27. So I'm bringing it up so you can see this, and then we'll move forward. So starting at verse 25 here, for Paul says, I do not want you, brothers and sisters, to be uninformed of this mystery. What mystery? The mystery of the Gentile inclusion into Israel. I don't want you to be uninformed of this mystery so that you will not be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until when the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. I believe that fullness will take place during the 7th week of Daniel. And then what happens in verse 26? And so all Israel will be saved, just as it is written. And this national salvation of Israel is at the very end of the 7th week. So he talks about the deliverer will come from Zion. He'll remove ungodliness from Jacob. This is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. The deliverer coming from Zion. Perhaps this is Jesus, who's already touched down on Mount Zion, split that thing in half, created a large valley that allows Israelites to come into Jerusalem or move around more freely, I should say, and then begin to turn the tide when it comes to persecution, turn the tide towards this rescue. If Jesus is here on earth, he's not just going to let his people suffer. He's going to do what Paul just says next. He will remove ungodliness from Jacob. So this is the national salvation event that we're referring to in the book of Isaiah as well. But notice what happens in verse 28. He says, in relation to the gospel, they are enemies. Give me a second. Is this where I want to go? Give me a second. that isn't the verse that I wanted to go. Maybe I already passed it. Give me a moment. I apologize. Take away their sins relation for a call for just your words by so they have also been so the depths of the riches who would wow. How embarrassing. I'm not at the passage that I wanted to be. I'm going to find it in post-production. I apologize. I don't have the right passage, but this is great. These are events that we're talking about in Isaiah right now. And this is information that we need. Let me just give me one more. There it is. It was earlier up in the chapter. So, starting in verse 12, this is where I wanted to go, is that the salvation of national Israel is connected to the bringing in of the Gentiles in fullness. But this is also connected to the event that we would call rapture. Now, if their wrongdoing proves to be riches for the world and their failure riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their fulfillment be? Notice Paul connecting Jew and Gentile together in this great plan of salvation that will culminate in the salvation of national Israel. Because at the time when Paul wrote this letter, the Gentiles were coming into Messiah en masse, but national Israel was still in stumbling mode. They were blind. They were rejecting Jesus and not accepting him. And so the message was going to the Gentiles through Paul's letters, right? He was the apostle sent to the Gentiles, and he was very happy to bring the Gentiles into what? Into God's family, but also into national Israel. He was bringing them into the olive tree. Jesus was bringing Gentiles into the olive tree via engrafting by their faith in him. So if their wrongdoing proves, the Jewish people, if their wrongdoing proves to be riches for the world, notice the kal v'chomer argument he's setting up, and their failure, the failure of national Israel, riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their national Israel's fulfillment? What is their fulfillment? Let's keep reading. But I am speaking to you who are Gentiles. Therefore, insofar as I am an apostle of Gentiles, Paul says, I magnify my ministry, if somehow I may move my own people to jealousy and save some of them. Now, here's the verse I wanted to highlight, the one that was stuck in my head. The one, by the way, that my good study buddy who's in the room with me, the team's room, he likes to highlight this as well. So this is why I also was reminded of it. Paul says to Gentiles listening to or reading his letters about Gentile inclusion into national Israel at the remnant level, for if their rejection, speaking of national Israel, if their rejection proves to be the reconciliation of the world, meaning the Gentiles who are outside of Israel, if the rejection of Israel, the rejection of Israel against their own Messiah, resulting in a temporary place of time out by God, if their rejection proves to be the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? If the first piece of dough is holy, the lump is also holy, and if the root is holy, the branches are as well. Now, why do I need this verse? Because we're talking about this first fruit principle that I mentioned earlier. When Paul says in verse 16, the first piece of dough is holy, he's talking about the principle that I mentioned earlier. In ancient Israelite practice, God instructed them to bring the first smaller tithe of harvest to the Lord, offer that up to God. God accepts that smaller tithe, and in so doing, that's God symbolically saying, I will bless the greater harvest. So when you go harvest, it will be abundant, and you can eat the fruit of the ground, the produce that is grown. You can eat whatever that you sowed, and I'll bless it because you followed my instructions. You sowed, and then you harvested, and I blessed it, and you brought the first fruits as a tithe unto me. You recognize that really all of it belongs to you, God, but you're only asking for the smaller first fruit, the tithe, the first sheaf, the omeri sheet. So, in similar fashion, the same logic applies that when we are offering up bread and offerings to the Lord, food offerings particularly, God says, pinch off a small piece of the dough and toss it into the fire as a lump to me, as a first fruit, as a offering to me. And then in so doing and separating that small piece out from the larger lump of dough, you're basically sanctifying the entire loaf by pinching off that smaller piece. Jewish people still do this in practice today when they make matzah for Passover. The kosher authorities that oversee this baking process will mix up the dough that's ready to be put into the oven very quickly and then taken out before the dough can rise. But they'll pinch off a small part and toss it into the fire and say, this is the first lump that goes to the Lord. Well, that's what Paul's talking about. The first piece of dough is holy. Then based on that principle, the lump is also holy. The whole rest of the dough is holy based on the principle of the first piece being sanctified unto the Lord. And if the root is holy, then he applies his principle to the tree. If the root of the tree that he's talking about here in his olive tree analogy is holy, then the branches are as well. And so it's in that context that he earlier said, if their rejection proves to be reconciliation of the world, what will their exceptions be but life from the dead? Is that life from the dead a resurrection? Well, in principle, it is. When you say life from the dead, remember what we looked at earlier in your dead will live in Isaiah. Your dead will live, their corpses will rise. You who lie in the dust awake and shout for joy. For your dew is as the dew of the dawn, and the earth will give birth to the departed spirits. So is this corresponding to Israel's life from the dead? Is this corresponding to Israel's national salvation? I believe it absolutely is. Here in Romans 11:15, their life from the dead happens sequentially after the fullness of the Gentiles has already come in. And it corresponds with the resurrection that Isaiah also would refer to. However, does Paul's definition here of life from the dead mean that national Israel is actually going to go through a physical resurrection from the life from the dead? What I'm trying to say is that if those Israelites haven't placed their faith in Messiah, I'm not yet convinced that they will go through a physical resurrection. That's my point. So I think that what Paul is talking about, he says, what will their acceptance be about life from the dead? Here in verse 15, I think this is more spiritual life from the dead, meaning they are spiritually dead and they need to come back spiritually to life. That's what I think he's referring to. I don't think he's talking about life from the physical dead. So the life there is not physical life so much as it's spiritual life. What will their acceptance be but spiritual life? There's regeneration from the inside out, salvation experience, things like that. So let's go back. Oops, not there. Let's go back and begin to wind down my commentary here. So going back down to where we left off. So Prewrath says that this this hiding and this resurrection and the activities that we're focusing on here in Isaiah 26, they correspond precisely to the day of the Lord, which is triggered after the rapture. And I go on to say that this means that God's people are protected from the day of the Lord, not from tribulation in general, but from the specific outpouring of his wrath, just as Isaiah 26 describes. Who are God's people in Isaiah? Well, first and foremost, they would be Israelites who are righteous, or those who have not, again, sided with Antichrist or taken the mark. Obviously, those type of people don't warrant protection from God. Although, who knows, in the confusion, earlier they sided with Antichrist, then they took his mark, then they see how wicked he turns out to be, and then they run off into hiding. Who knows? All kinds of confusion might be going on there. But generally speaking, I believe the verses in Isaiah are talking about God's people being protected from the day of the Lord is more broadly speaking of those Israelites who fled Jerusalem and the protection that is afforded to those of us who are believers. Thus, the protection would be our rapture. Why do I say that? Because I still don't follow from the post-trib that we need to be protected through the day of the Lord. I'm believing that we're going to be raptured prior to it. But again, I could be wrong. And if that's the case, then I had to write this clause. God's people protected from the day of the Lord would be the post-trib position, being protected supernaturally somehow from the day of the Lord activities. But either way, whether the pre-tribs are right, whether the pre-wrathers are right or the post-tribs are right, either way, both of us agree that we're not protected from tribulation in general. Nope. Neither one of us are. All right, so let's sum it up here. I've got about 7 minutes. Summing it all up, here's what we find. Prewrath sees Isaiah 26, 20 to 21 as prophetic support for the timing and theology of the rapture. All right, in case you're not following along. Enter your rooms equals the rapture, where believers are taken to heavenly safety. Until indignation runs its course equals the day of the Lord's wrath poured out through the trumpet and bold judgments. And the Lord comes out to punish the earth equals the very start of the eschatological judgment, not the second coming at Armageddon. So going back over to my graphic here, we're talking largely about, give me a second, let me pull up this one. We're talking largely about, let me erase some of this stuff. We're talking largely about these activities. Right here is the rapture, right? That part, which means it cuts short the Great Tribulation. Well, that looks horrible. Can't see that. Great Tribulation is here, and the sixth seal sign triggers the, separates, I should say, the day of the Lord from the Great Tribulation itself. So the rapture event here is needed to separate the Great Tribulation from the day of the Lord, and to thus show that God allows his people to go through tribulation, but does not need to put them into his day of the Lord punishment scheme. The Lord comes out to punish the earth. The earth deserves the punishment because they have been persecuting his people. And Satan at this point in time has declared himself God of this world. Remember, he takes his seat in the temple of God at the midpoint and declares himself to be God and commands everyone in the world to worship him, imposing his mark system that deceives everyone into worshiping him. That's part of the great deception that's going to be ramped up in that in that particular time frame. Let's keep going. Saved Jews and Gentiles will be raptured, while some unsaved Israelites in Jerusalem will hide to endure global wrath. So I go on to say that in my conclusion that I think that this fits seamlessly within the pre-wrath sequence. Let's read up these bullet points to make you understand. Point number 1, midpoint of the 7th week, Antichrist revealed, Great Tribulation begins. I'm describing a sequencing now. Sequencing related to, similar to this whole week here. So let me erase some of those things again. Get those off the screen. So we're looking at here, and so I'm going to start describing things starting here with the abomination of desolation. That's the midpoint of the week. So midpoint of the 7th week, Antichrist revealed, Great Tribulation begins. Point number 2, shortened tribulation for the sake of the elect. This is the pre-wrath position I'm describing. This is not the pre-trib, the mid-trib, or even the post-trib. This is the pre-wrath rapture. Shortened tribulation for the sake of the elect. Go back and read Matthew 24:22. Who's the elect? The elect is the church. The elect is remnant Israel. The elect are the bride. The elect is the group of believers who will enter into the 70th week at that time and will begin to suffer for their faith in Messiah. Specifically, that's what the elect are in the direct sense of the word. However, those Israelites who listened to the Lord and ran away, they are part of the elect, but they're not those who are in Messiah elect. They don't name the name of Messiah, but they're still God's elect. So I'm not leaving them out of the picture. But when we talk about tribulation for Messiah, that is the church. Shortened tribulation for the sake of those elect. Matthew 24, shortened tribulation. Number 3, cosmic signs. 6th seal, Revelation 6:12, 17. Cosmic signs, going back over here real quick. Cosmic signs are down here. 6 seal, signs in the sky, correspond to a rapture at that point in time. Notice the separation from the Great Tribulation right there. Okay, going back over. Point number 4, rapture and rescue. Isaiah 26:20, Matthew 24:31, Revelation 7:9-14. Rapture and rescue. Rescue of those who are rapture ready at the moment. Will national Israel be ready for rescue? No. She won't be ready at the time of rapture and resurrection. She won't be ready for rescuing. She still has to endure many hardships through, even though she's hiding out, she still has to endure many hardships. She still has to contend with Yeshua face to face, I believe. We'll talk about that one day, but today we can't. she will meet her Messiah at the end of the 7th week. But she, at this point in time, when the initiation event known as rapture happens, I don't believe she's ready. And then point number 5, wrath of God begins, Isaiah 26:21, Revelation 8 and following. And so in my conclusionary part of this commentary, I say, that keeps jumping. I'm going to learn to do that better. Thus, Isaiah 26:20-21 is a strikingly consistent Old Testament passage that aligns with Prewrath's eschatological framework. And thus, when all relevant passages are interpreted in harmony, we can affirm that the sequence created by the following, basic sequence. I don't like the fact that I use sequence there twice, but oh well. Here's the sequence I kind of looked at before. Great tribulation leads into rapture, which leads into wrath. Okay, so how would that look on this particular slide? It would look like this. Great tribulation. Let me zoom in so you can see this better. Great tribulation leads into rapture, which leads into wrath. So that's kind of what I'm talking about here. So we have this stuff here, making the arrows darker. Then we have a rapture here. Then we have the day of the Lord stuff here. Okay? That's kind of what I'm describing. Great tribulation leads into rapture, which then leads into wrath. And I go on to say that this sequence affirms that the rapture is not merely a rescue. It's a covenantal fulfillment that honors God's promises to both Israel and the church, gathering all who are in Messiah into his presence before his wrath is poured out. So we've got time. No, we don't have time. We'll do the summary and then conclusion next week. Summary is like 7 points. You know what? Yes, I will. It's only 7 points. And even though I've got like 20 seconds left on my timer, I absolutely want to do this summary because then we're done with this section. So, Excursus 2 summary, and then I'm done. Point number 1, the rapture gathering as described in Matthew 24:31, 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and 17, and 1 Corinthians 15:52 is far more than a dramatic removal of believers from earth. So this is where the pre-tribbers are kind of doing a disservice to the rapture passages. They're treating it like it's just this secret event that only involves the church and that only the church is going to notice. You know, they talk about it being a secret rapture. They talk about it being in the twinkling of an eye. They talk, and I'm saying this not in mock, but I'm saying this to show that I believe that they're not giving it the full weight of the magnitude of what the rapture represents in the Bible. It's this glorious event that is the culmination of these promises that were given to Israel of rescuing those who are righteous in Israel. And here's the key to understanding how those covenant promises are fulfilled by the rapture. It's that the church has been grafted into Israel. Hello? And therefore, promises made to righteous Israelites apply to the church because she represents righteous Israel. At least at the remnant level. Has she overtaken Israel? No. Has she superseded Israel? No. Has she replaced Israel? No. None of that replacement, supersessionism, dispensational nonsense needs to be applied here. We're simply talking about an event that connects promises made to Israel to the final fulfillment of what's going to happen at the end of the 7th week, when greater national Israel finally accepts Messiah and joins the rest of the family that already does accept Messiah, namely the remnant, meaning when the rest of national Israel catches up to the remnant. So the rapture gathering is this dramatic removal of believers from earth. It represents the culmination of God's covenant promises to Israel and to grafted-in Gentiles, uniting them as one redeemed people in Messiah. Don't disconnect the rapture from the salvation of national Israel. I think this is a grave error that the pre-tribbers make. They just don't see it, right? Their dispensational framework causes them to take the church out of any meaningful connection with Israel. They don't think that God can deal with the church and Israel at the same time. But I beg to differ with you. All right. Point number 2. This event, the rapture we're talking about, it fulfills Israel's covenant calling to be a light to the nation with the ultimate salvation and restoration of the remnant as promised in Jeremiah 31, Ezekiel 36, and Romans 11. This event is Israel saying to the nations, you can be righteous if you place your faith in the same God that we already place our faith in. That's the larger picture. As the Gentiles learned about this righteous God and his righteous Messiah, they placed their faith in this Messiah, which equaled faith in God, which resulted in them being brought into the salvation picture. A picture that was formerly hidden from national Israel and not given to Gentiles, and Paul became the apostle to the Gentiles. So we need to see how the rapture is part of this larger plan of eschatological events that all fits together in God's salvation program. Don't see the salvation rapture of the church as separated from the salvation of national Israel. We've got to see that there's one kingdom promised to God's people going all the way back to Daniel. I've got to slow down a little bit and show this to you because this is also significant. Notice in Daniel chapter 7, we find passages starting in verse 9. Daniel says, he's looking at it's this vision. I kept looking until thrones were set up. Daniel 7:9. I kept looking until thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His garment was white as snow, and the hairs of his head were pure wool. His throne was ablaze with flames, and his wheels were a burning fire. A river fire was flowing and coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands were serving him, and myriads upon myriads were standing before him. The court convened. Watch this, people. The court convened. The books were opened. And then I kept looking because of the sound of the boastful words which the horn was speaking. He's the bad guy, okay? The horn. He's the bad guy. I kept looking until the beast was killed and its body was destroyed and given to the burning fire. As for the rest of the beast, their dominion was taken away, but for an extension of life was granted to them for an appointed period of time. Let's keep reading. Verse 13. The Son of Man presented as the title heading in my Bible version. This is NASB. Verse 13, I kept looking in the night visions, Daniel says. Here's the part I want you to watch for. I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven. What's that? The clouds of heaven. Sounds like the rapture event that Paul's going to describe later, that Jesus is going to describe later, that these clouds of heaven indicate. I kept looking in the night visions. Behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. He came up to the Ancient of Days. It jumps in sequence to this is an overview, a big zoom out, but it jumps from the rapture and snaps it together with the end of the 70th week. One like a son of man was coming, and he came up to the Ancient of Days. And what happened? He was presented before him, and to him was given dominion, honor, and a kingdom. Here's the part I want you to notice. Christians, please listen. To him was given dominion, honor, and a kingdom, so that all the peoples, nations, and populations of all languages, that people is the Gentile nations being given to Yeshua as the inheritance, just like his father promised to give way back in the Psalms. Right? Ask of me and I'll give you the nations as your inheritance. I think that's either Psalm 2 or it might be Psalm 110. I get those two confused. But to him was given dominion, honor, and a kingdom, so that all the peoples, nations, and populations of all languages might serve him. This is, of course, King Messiah. But notice this kingdom is given to Yeshua, and it says his dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away. His kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. So these are end of the 70th week events, right? The ushering in of the millennial kingdom. But it's within that context that Daniel continues. As for me, Daniel, my spirit was distressed within me, and the visions in my mind kept alarming me. I approached one of those who were standing by and began requesting of him the exact meaning of this. So he told me it may be known to the interpretation of these things. And notice the extreme zoom out, but notice the climax. These great beasts, which are four in number and are four kings who will rise from the earth. Verse 18 is what I wanted you to notice as well. But the saints of the highest one will receive the kingdom and take possession of the kingdom forever, for all ages to come. Stop. Question. In Daniel's understanding, who are the saints of the highest one that are receiving the kingdom? He just earlier talked about this mighty Son of Man coming and receiving an everlasting dominion and a kingdom, right? His kingdom is one which should not be destroyed. To him was given a kingdom, right? Verse 14, to him was given dominion, honor, and a kingdom. So it's obviously the same kingdom in verse 18. The saints of the highest one will receive the kingdom. Obviously, this kingdom is shared by this righteous Son of Man King and his righteous saints of the highest one, the kingdom saints. So a king without a kingdom is no king. I've heard one pastor say it that way. So my question of who are the saints of the highest one? If you asked Daniel, he would have said righteous Israelites. Do you think Daniel knew that this actually included Gentiles brought from all around the world? Well, he should have. He could have picked up on that because it mentioned it in verse earlier in verse 14. All the peoples, nations, and populations of all languages might serve him. So he should have caught that. Of course, national Israel didn't quite understand how the Gentiles would be brought into national Israel. They thought maybe they would join Israel and become Israelites, something to that effect. But the point I'm trying to highlight in my closing part of my study is that now that we know as New Testament Christians that the saints of the highest one here in the book of Daniel must include Gentile Christians who place their faith in Messiah, then because righteous Gentiles in Messiah join righteous remnant Israelites in the inheritance of this kingdom and receiving the kingdom, then we can now know that there's just one kingdom for God's people. There's only one righteous king, and there's only one righteous kingdom that we will receive. So the saints of the highest one who will receive the kingdom is a combination of Gentiles in Messiah plus those who are in Israel who by this point in time will have accepted Messiah, Yeshua, at the end of the 70th week, because we're talking about the kingdom being ushered in. So going back over to my study, the event that fulfills Israel's covenant calling to be a light to the nations with the ultimate salvation and restoration of the remnant as promised in Jeremiah 31, Ezekiel 36, and Romans 11. All of these are kind of talking about the same event, which is the salvation of national Israel, their life from the dead that we talked about in Romans 11. But that event is connected to the rapture event, which is the first fruits of the bigger event. That's the whole point. And there's one kingdom that we all enjoy. I'm stressing this because I got some pushback from a few viewers to my videos, and they're like, Ariel, there's a kingdom that God gives to Israel, and then there's a kingdom that we Christians inherit. Two different kingdoms. I'm like, what? What Bible are you reading? There's only one righteous kingdom. I just read it for you in Daniel. And the saints of the Most High includes those who are righteous by God's standard. And therefore, if you're trying to tell me that there's two different kingdoms, I want to see that one somewhere in the Bible. Two different kingdoms? How will one king rule over two different kingdoms? If Jesus is the king of Christians, of the church, who's the king over the kingdom that the Israelites are going to inherit? You who are giving me this hyper-dispensational perspective that there's two different kingdoms. What kind of nonsense is that? Are there two kings? Is God ruling over the kingdom with the Jews? And Jesus is ruling over the kingdom with the Christians? Is that what's taking place in eternity? I didn't see that one in the Bible. If it is there, someone please make a note in this comment to this video and tell me where I'm missing that, where there's actually two kingdoms and one is, one is the kingdom for Christians and the other is the kingdom for Jews. And if you're going to write in and tell me that it's actually the kingdom that's in our hearts that's the one for Christians and the physical one is for Jews, well, that's weird too, because the kingdom that's in our hearts isn't the one that Daniel was talking about, where he says the kingdom was given to unless I'm reading it wrong, right? But the saints of the highest one will receive the kingdom and take possession of the kingdom forever. Is that a heart kingdom that Daniel's talking about? I don't think so. It's a physical kingdom. But let's keep going. Point number 3, Gentile believers share equally in this promise as taught in Ephesians 2, Romans 11, and Galatians 3. Equally in the promise given to national Israel, being joined into the same household of faith. So I am really stressing this idea that Gentiles have been grafted into Israel, whatever metaphor you want to use that makes sense of this picture. Gentiles grafted into the Commonwealth of Israel. That's one picture. Sons and daughters joining to the family of Abraham per Galatians chapter 3 and Romans chapter 4. That's another analogy. The nations being grafted in, or being brought together into the one nation of Israel. That's another way you can see it as well. Different metaphors in the Bible, but they all kind of amount to the same thing. Point number 4, the rapture occurs after the Great Tribulation, but before the outpouring of God's wrath, delivering God's people from the coming indignation. Self-explanatory. Point number 5, Isaiah 26, 19 through 21, this time, backing up one verse, beautifully captures this sequence. Resurrection, verse 19, then safe hiding, verse 20, before divine wrath, verse 21, paralleling John 14's promise of a prepared place and Psalm 27's promise of concealment. Point number 6, this is my summary and then we're done. Prewrath sees this as a direct prophetic framework. After the Antichrist persecution, the rapture will gather Jew and Gentile believers into heavenly safety before the day of the Lord's wrath is unleashed. So this is the rescue operation that takes us into heaven because we're rapture ready and we place our faith in Messiah, both Jew and Gentile. We're remnant Israelites. However, national Israelites who went into hiding are still going to have to remain in hiding while God pours out his day of the Lord wrath on planet Earth, on wicked human beings. So this is on earth wrath that happens during the Daniel 70th week time frame. So that's why earlier I called that eschatological wrath, but perhaps some people are confused. What is eschatological wrath? Real-time wrath poured out on living people that did not need to be resurrected in order to experience that wrath of God. In plain language, 70th week of Daniel wrath. Okay, it happens on planet Earth. It doesn't happen somewhere wherever the great white throne judgment is. I don't know where that's going to take place. A renewed heaven and earth, somewhere, a pocket dimension or something like that, to borrow modern kind of terminology that we pick up from sci-fi movies and things like that. Pocket dimension. I don't know where that's going to take place. Could be on earth, might not be. But let's keep reading. We're almost done here. Final point number 7, and then we're done with this section. This sequence that I'm describing, the Great Tribulation, then Rapture, then God's wrath, I believe that it preserves God's covenant faithfulness to Israel while including all who are in Messiah and harmonizes Old and New Testament prophecy into a unified, consistent end times hope. And we're done. We're done with this section. So what we can look forward to next time is turning to this section. Oops, I'm sorry. Not this section. Not yet. We have one more answering. Give me a second. Here we go. Answering pre-wrath weaknesses. Point number 2, the sealed judgments are not the wrath of God. This one shouldn't take as long because it's not as long. You can see I zoomed down through it. It's like, I think in Word document it was like 1.5 pages. But the pre-tribbers think that since we pre-wrathers interpret the sealed judgments as not part of God's wrath, the pre-tribbers say that this is a weakness of ours. And so we're going to turn into that next week. But we're done for now. That'll do it for eschatology, a biblical study of end time events.